What would it take to eliminate poverty in Canada by the year 2030? This is the 2030 Project. It's a podcast that explores why poverty persists and what we can do about it in this country. We endeavor to uncover what's been successful with Canada's poverty reduction strategy, but then what needs to come next? The 2030 Project tackles some of the biggest and the most pressing social issues facing this country today. I'm Dave Trafford, and thanks for joining us. So as we've gone through this series, we normally start the whole episode by posing that question, is it possible to reduce poverty by 50% by the year 2030? And that is the 2030 Project. And we would have this big, fancy produced piece and lots of thoughtful, context for the show that we're going in. But right now you can hear in the background, we're right now on the floor at the Daily Bread Food Bank. And these are the folks who invested the time and the energy to sort of focus this question for us throughout the series, the 2030 Project. And this is where we started. We began with Neil Hetherington and Talia Bronstein. Talia is the head of Research and Advocacy here at Daily Bread. Neil is the CEO. And, I think for both of you, when we look at the way this has gone over, the better part of 10 episodes, 10 half-hour, I think fairly intense conversations that we've had about the things that you guys bullet pointed pretty well in that first episode. Talia, I thought I knew what I was going to get when I dug into some of these conversations. I like to think I'm paying attention. And, you and Neil and I walked through, we talked through, we sort of sketched out what were the big questions that we wanted to get into. And I found myself at the end of almost every episode surprised and having learned something and I think on the one hand, that's a good thing. On the other hand, I despaired a little bit that as important as the subject we were talking about didn't seem to be resonating enough with the general public to the point where I was asking the question, what is it we need to do to push the button to cut through? And that's my own that's my own come to the moment. You live it. That's part of the passion that brings you to work every day. Am I overstating that?
No, I think you're definitely onto something important, which is that when people think about poverty, they think of it perhaps as an income issue, right? And so there's a simple solution to that. If people don't have enough income, let's make sure that they have income. But what I'm hoping people have learned throughout this podcast is that I like to say income is necessary but not sufficient to lift people out of poverty. It's such a broader issue. There's issues of housing, of childcare, of economic opportunity and employment training and education. There's so many pieces that play into letting people enjoy a life of dignity that I think sometimes get lost a little bit in our viewpoint of sort of poverty means you just don't have enough to make ends meet.
Yeah, and Neil, it's easy to kind of get really academic about this. And I think at some points you have to. If we're going to be forward thinking, we got to sort of get to the point where we look at this and say, what's at the root of the problem? Structurally, what's the issue from a policy perspective? But we can hear people grinding it out right now in the background that are making this happen on a day-by-day basis where there's urgency about this on so many levels. How do we balance those things off in terms of senses of urgency, degrees of urgency?
Well, I think it probably starts with values. Daily Bread has one of its core tenets is that people have a right to food, that we are a rights-based organization. And so if you can start with that practical or that value of people's rights not being realized, then the practical starts to flow from there. So what are the things that we need to do to be able to realize that right from that value? And then overlaid on top of that and guiding it is another one of the values of Daily Bread, that it's evidence-based. And that's where Talia and the academia come into play, that can calculate not only what the costs of poverty are, the magnitude of poverty, but also the solutions to those systemic problems. But I think it all goes back to what are the values.
So how, and I know you guys live this on a daily basis, how do we make sure that we increase the intensity to pull those two things together? The values are at the core of it, but to be able to say, we want to speed this up, because right now we've learned clearly over the last 10 episodes that the pandemic has put us in more of a hole than we were already in. So it just made the challenge all the greater, in terms of reducing poverty. So where do we make sure that there are fewer gaps just in terms of that mechanism to make sure that we've got that value system working with whatever we want in terms of policy?
Well, for one thing that I think is going to be important is that it's as I listen to and re-listen to each of the episodes that we had, I'm reminded in what Talia has already said, it's a complex problem. And so how do you simplify it as much as possible so that there are leaders who can latch on to some of those solutions and make it palatable for the constituency as a whole to get behind those simple messages? And that's a very difficult job to do. There is just so many layers, so many new podcasts I think that we need to do to be able to unwrap that and get people excited about the possibility of hope.
Okay, and as much as I would love to be doing more podcasts, Talia, and because I think it's a great way to get the message out, who needs to be listening to this? How do we get this into the right ear?
That's a good question. I mean, ultimately, I think every person needs to be listening to this in different capacities, right? Because I think the general public doesn't necessarily think on a day-to-day level about some of these public policy issues if it doesn't directly affect them. So, for example, if you don't have kids, you might not be thinking about childcare policy on the regular. If you aren't living in poverty, you might not be thinking about all of these different barriers that people are experiencing. So I think there's definitely a general education piece that needs to happen. And then I think for our elected representatives, I mean, they enter politics because they care about community, because they want to make a difference. But they're regular people like you and me, and they're not necessarily people who have any specific training in public policy, although, of course, some do. But they're people who need to take in information and make good decisions. And I think supporting that education work from different perspectives, be it academic or community, lived experience, to enable policymakers to make good decisions, I think is something that, as Canadians, we all have a role in playing that accountability piece to our elected representatives as well.
And one of the things, though, and I'll say it, I think we have, to some degree, and we've politicized poverty, Neil, and to the extent where up until this most recent cabinet shuffle, or the new cabinet for the new government, let's put it that way, we did have a minister who was responsible for the well-being of the middle class in this country. And in some cases, people sort of laughed at that, and they said, well, what do we need that for? That's the most ridiculous thing I ever heard. But when we really look at the foundations of this strategy to reduce poverty, it was really an important part of it was to include more people into the middle class. And if we no longer have that ministerial focus, what does that tell you at a federal government level? Have we abandoned that?
Well, first of all, I think you're right in saying we've politicized poverty. Some would say, it's systemic, and others would talk about individual responsibilities, and it becomes political, and it ought not to be. I was encouraged during the last election that it was spoken about more. Affordable housing was I believe the number 2 item on most of the political platforms. It was good to see. Now, it was reframed, and we talked about that in one of the podcasts. It was reframed as affordability, so that it became more tangible for the general public to latch onto and say, well, that matters to me. I can't afford housing, or I can't afford the basics in terms of food, and it became very personal versus this sort of far-off concept to too many people about what poverty was. So I was appreciative of that, and I think it's just a constant drumbeat of making sure that advocates are letting politicians know and letting the general public know that poverty is, first of all, fundamentally against the values that we espouse, and second, that it's incredibly costly. And so whichever path you take, the solution is you need to reduce poverty in the country.
Yeah, I guess that at that level, once we can logically walk through this, and we can actually, there's a price tag for poverty, Talia, and certainly here in this province, the number that's thrown around is that $33 billion, but there isn't a centralized view of it, and that complicates things further. I guess the issue here is, at what point do we, and you've already alluded to it, personalize this experience for all Canadians? At what point do we, I suggested to somebody, you probably don't know this, but there's somebody that you work with, maybe somebody in your family, a good friend, who requires the services of the Daily Bread Food Bank. And that's because in some form or fashion, they live to some degree of poverty. And as soon as I said that to people, no way. I said, well, you've got what? What's the number? 1.4 million visitors you think you're going to have to the Bread Food Bank this year? That's bigger than most cities, if you take that per visit and populations, than we have in the GTA. It's bigger than the population of Markham. It's bigger than the population of Mississauga. I mean, if every one of those people visited, you would still have more visitors or more visits to the Daily Bread Food Bank. And I think the enormity of the problem might be the problem. Does that make sense?
I think there's certainly a lot of stigma, which is why food insecurity is often hidden. And I think it just goes to the point of why lived experience is so important in policymaking. Because the people who generally are making policy are people who aren't personally experiencing the issue, and are people who are, using research and different techniques to try and understand the issue. And all of those things are important, don't get me wrong, but if you are lacking that lived experience dimension, if you're not hearing directly from the people who are experiencing these barriers and challenges, you're always going to miss the mark. Because when you go out and you talk to folks who are on social assistance, for example, they can list off 20 different things that are barriers within that program that are making it more difficult for them to actually exit poverty. And if you're an administrator or a policymaker, you might not see that. You see on paper, okay, well, we have an employment support program. Therefore, everyone should be able to get a job. But until you actually talk to people and you try to understand what has your experience been, what are those barriers, you're never going to be able to make programs and services that reflect people's true needs. And of course, there's a diversity in that too. Not everyone's going to have the same experience, particularly, if you're racialized, if you have a disability, there's additional barriers that are going to be faced. So I think that lived experience dimension is just critical.
Well, yeah, and I think the barrier point is an important one to get at, though, Neil, because some of that barrier is my own understanding of what the solution might be. And Talia talks about having a job, and so often the answer is, well, hell, we've just come out of the pandemic. We're looking for people who need, employees, and we can't find anybody. And clearly, it must mean they're sitting on their ass at home collecting some kind of dole, and we get off on that tangent. And the idea is that even if that were true, and it's not, but even if it were true, what I learned in the last 10 weeks is that the job in and of itself is not the solution.
No, and as Talia reiterated right at the beginning, it's not just about income. If it was just about income, it's way easier. It's simply write the check. I think it's also important to re-emphasize what you said in terms of lived experience and going to the experts. The experts are not us at Daily Bread in terms of practically handing food out or our academic work that we do. The experts are the individuals who are experiencing poverty. who can lay out clear pathways forward to be able to reduce it. Now, the difficulty in going there is you might find out the answers which you might not want to hear, and maybe that's why it doesn't always happen the way that it ought to. When we were going through the podcasts and when we were listening to people with lived experience, the thing that stood out to me the most was a sense of hope that so many of them brought forward on a regular basis, a sense of deep gratitude that community came together, and hope that there would be policy changes resulting in systemic improvements for them. But I don't know if you two shared that viewpoint, but I certainly took that away from listening to the people that are affected the most.
Well, I was blown away, when one woman we spoke to said, I live below the poverty line, but I live in abundance, Talia. And I thought, okay, that's an extraordinary life experience for sure, but it's a perspective that I don't think a lot of people fully appreciate. There is this stigma, there's a stereotype of those who live in poverty, one, those who require the benefits, two, particularly if it's a disability benefit, all of those things. And I think to Neil's point, that's what, again, I share that, that was a highlight for me. And universally, to your point, they said, you want to know how to fix this? Just ask us. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that meaningful engagement piece is so important. I think, of course, there's a diversity of experiences, and there's a lot of people who feel really disenfranchised, who have, been through the ringer of course, we want to consult with you. We're going to come out and talk to you, and then we're going to disregard all of your opinions and all of your input, or, barriers to voting, or, just so many times where the government has said, we're going to improve this program, and it's actually gotten worse. So I think, it was wonderful to hear, some people have optimism. I think we could certainly find a lot of pessimism as well from people who are, just going up against these huge systems that are really designed to keep them in poverty ultimately. So, but that's why it's so important to talk.
Or is this sort of a well-intended system that has just not really thought through to the final stage? I mean, I should be the guy who's the skeptic or perhaps cynical on this, watching from where I do. But I want to think that at least the systems were developed to be well-intended, that they weren't intended to keep people in poverty.
No, I think you're probably right. I mean, ask me. It depends if I'm on a cynical day or not. Because I do think there's a lot of economic structures that are not designed with, people's well-being in mind. I think social programs do start with, a good intention, but we're operating within a world where, we've gone down the garden path in many respects in what we prioritize as a society. But I think you're right that ultimately, we tend to try to fix policies by, adding little bits and pieces here, kind of, filling holes within the system, rather than having the courage, I think, to step back and say, what kind of a system and structure, what kind of a policy framework do we even want to approach this with? And I understand why. It's extremely complicated. I did some work on a provincial system transition in a previous life, and just the amount of work it took to change. It was a healthcare screening test. From one test to another took us about 5 years. So to overhaul a whole complicated system, it's not like something like social assistance or how subsidized housing works. I know it's an enormous task, but I think we should be unafraid to tackle those big issues rather than try to plug holes.
I want to talk about solutions, because I think that's really what the whole point of this was, and that what we have done is laid bare perhaps some of the challenges in the system, intended or otherwise. So, and I don't want to be the one to drive this. So where do you guys, based on this larger conversation, I don't know how much of that was surprising to you or not, but certainly I learned a lot. Where do you think the priority should be in terms of tackling the low-hanging fruit, or is there any, as far as solutions are concerned?
So there are a few points that I want to get in there. Talia was talking about making changes, just tinkering around a little bit with some of the changes. And in my former career, I was in home building. And sometimes renovating a house is a whole lot more difficult than just tearing it down and starting over again. And there are parts of me that think maybe that's actually kind of the easier thing that we ought to do, where there are fundamental changes. We talked a lot about the basic income ideas that are out there, and whether or not Canada should be moving in those directions. And I think that's one of the fundamental changes that is growing in popularity. I'd like us to, from a solution perspective, talk about how poverty works its way into high schools from an academic perspective. I would love every student across the country to listen to these 12 episodes and hear what is going on and what the solutions are, and become familiar with poverty, because they're probably in that classroom. There's one or two of their classmates whose families are going through a very difficult time. So I would like to see some change on that front, and building a coalition of the willing to be able to do something that is revolutionary in approach to the social policies that we need.
Yeah, it's funny. The revolution came up a couple of times in various contexts throughout the podcast series, Talia. I heard the other side of this, though, that the system is moving along. We can't afford to tear it down and start again, whether it was with one component or not. So, again, well-intended viewpoints here. Do you think that what do you view as is there low-hanging fruit where we can kind of look at it and say we can make a difference in the next 10 years?
I think there's a ton of spaces where we can make a huge difference. I think, to me, the three pillars that need our attention are affordable housing, income supports, and decent work. And if we can move the needle in those three areas, there's so many changes needed, and as Neil mentioned, some might need an overhaul and some might need more of a renovation, if you will. But if we focus on those three areas, if we make those three pillars kind of a priority in where we focus our efforts, I think we will see really meaningful change, particularly with affordable housing. If you ask most people living in Canada, do we have a housing affordability issue? I think the vast majority at all income levels would say yes. So clearly there's no awareness of that issue. There's, as Neil mentioned, all the political parties have made that a priority in their campaigns. So clearly it's an issue that we need to deal with. It is very pressing. It's something we're seeing on the ground all the time at the food bank, just the high cost of housing and driving food insecurity. So I think there are a lot of areas where we can make immediate progress, and we can keep thinking big picture at the same time. It doesn't have to be an either or. For example, BC had an advisory panel to explore basic income, and that would have been a fundamental shift. Now, they ended up recommending against a universal basic income and instead put forward a number of recommendations for more targeted income support. So based on their analysis, it was better in that context to work within the existing structures, to strengthen, to add. So I don't think there's anything wrong with that if we're exploring those big picture ideas, but let's give them the attention that they deserve, and let's not be afraid to ask the big questions. We might not pursue that as the solution, but let's ask those questions so that we at least know, was that the right solution or not, rather than making assumptions.
But here's the problem with what happened in British Columbia from my perspective as the guy, on the media side of things, is I understand why you think that's positive, and I agree with you. I think they identified some really specific areas where they would look at this and say, the universal part of it is probably not where we want to go. We want to look at the targeted areas. As I listened through to everybody talking to us over the last 10 or 12 weeks, that makes sense to me now. But that didn't cut through with the general public. Those who listened to it said, you see, basic income doesn't work. They've just proved it in British Columbia. That's a hard thing to turn around now that we've done all that work.
This is the challenge with public policy. When you get the policy wonks, speaking their language, it does not always necessarily translate. So I'm hoping this podcast series has helped to cut across that and make it a little bit more accessible, because those documents, can be very technical, and, most people are not going to read through, a 90-page report with, 170 recommendations or whatever it is. But I think, there's lots of organizations like Daily Bread, like so many others, that are trying to make that more accessible, more engaging to people, to be part of that conversation, because as Neil was mentioning, it's important that people have a voice, and starting with teenagers or even younger and all the way to adulthood, I think people can be intimidated by public policy because it gets so technical, and also just maybe don't have it doesn't spark an interest with them if it doesn't personally affect them. So making it more accessible to people, I think, is an important piece to engaging people.
Neil, one of the things that came up a couple of times, and again, I just asked those who were living the experience and those who had done some of the policy work, what do you think it would be? Indexing benefits on some of these pensions would have gone a long way to have at least slowed the concern. By not indexing the pensions or indexing the benefit, we have created more of a problem. And it just seems so obvious, and we're not doing it. And it doesn't seem to be part of the conversation.
Well, we index where the votes are. So there is an index of the Canada Child Benefit, but we haven't been indexing the Ontario Works welfare. We haven't been indexing Ontario Disability. And you got to ask the fundamental question, why is that? And cynically, and rarely am I cynical, but in this case I am. Cynically, I think that's it has to do with re-elections much more than good fundamental policy. But yes, income supports, as Talia said, absolutely. Index them, absolutely. It should be, and it shouldn't actually be anything other. Find out what the right rate is, because we're still underwater from cuts that happened in 1995. Find out what the right rate should be and index it on an annual basis, and let it that's what it is. It should be easier to do that way. But also getting back into the games where we made a mistake. When the federal government left housing in the 90s, that was a fundamental error. And it pushed down the responsibility of housing, which cannot be done at a local level to the degree that it needs to be done. I want to see, the needle move when it comes to what the waiting list is for social housing in Toronto. Right now, it's some 70,000 families on the waiting list for social housing, and I want to see that list decrease. Not because they've abandoned and left the list, but rather there's been housing developed for them, both with the private and public sector. But the public sector needs to get back in there, and then starting to work towards reform when it comes to EI. We know, and we do have, there's a podcast, a portion of a podcast that speaks to the reform that has to come into the times when it comes to the gig economy and how people are working. And, there's a fundamental one. I know I'm going on and on, but there are some fundamental changes that we can make that I think have popularity right across the board, that result in a workforce that is properly housed. So that that seems to make sense for corporate Canada, making sure that there is decent income so that we can have the purchasing power across the country to increase demand for goods. Like, there's a whole host of good reasons to be doing these if you're just looking at it from a self-interest perspective. But again, to my first point, I think it's got to be values-based.
So who's the choreographer here? Because you've described a very complicated dance. It doesn't mean that can't be accomplished. And again, I think I put it to the panels on various roundtables. I'm not sure government's the one to rely on here.
I think they've got to be. I heard that throughout, and Dave, you did mention it. All the people have to come to the dance. But there does need to be a quarterback. There does need to be somebody who is choreographing this difficult dance, and we've got the play-by-play. We've got the poverty reduction strategy in hand, and so I do think that government needs to play a bigger role in there, and there does. And that's their job. That's what they're elected to do. And that's why we have some really smart people in bureaucratic positions who are setting these policies that will, in my mind, and hopefully get to the point where Project 2030 is realized.
And can I, jump in on that as well? I agree 100%. And I think it's important to remember a government is not just a funder, but they're also a regulator, right? They're also shaping the direction of how the rest of the actors in the country are permitted to kind of operate. So when we think about, for example, the role of the private sector, they are going to be responding to the parameters set out by the government. And we've sort of learned if we let private sector sort of operate with their own best interests in mind, we don't necessarily always get the best interests of society at large, right? So I think that's why government has such an important role to play, because they are the ones thinking about that bigger picture. And it's so critical that government is playing that role because government is accountable to each and every one of us. So, we have a role in pushing government to where we want it to be, to reflect our values. And in turn, government should be making policies that reflect what people are looking for in the country. So I think that it is that interplay, and government has to be taking responsibility, as I do think all levels of government are aware that they have that role to play. It's just a matter of how many resources do we invest where, and what are the priorities? But I think we could do with bumping this one up in the priority list.
Let's assume for a second that does happen. But I think and I think this is where you get pushback. You start to talk about regulation as opposed to incentive, and I realize that in some the language might kind of vary. But we have to make it worthwhile for everybody to pitch in on this. And I think is that not the role where government plays its most important role, as opposed to saying stick. Is the carrot not the thing that we want here?
Oh, I think you can do both. I think there's both a case to be made for decent regulations, while at the same time rewarding those who. But that's the minimum bar, and then looking at what are the incentives to be able to bring about change that you want to see. So I think it's a both, not an either or.
Final thought from you, Talia, before we wrap this up.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a really interesting podcast experience. I think, I've learned a lot on the way. And I think what I'm hoping people walk away with is that, yes, these are complex issues, but that shouldn't make us afraid to tackle them. We tackle complexity every day in our lives. Existing as a human is complex, and it involves grappling with big questions and grappling with our values. And so this is really no different. And I just hope that people walk away from this podcast feeling like they have a voice in shaping the direction that we go as a country, and where we prioritize, where we put resources, and just why it's so critical, it's so timely and urgent that we make poverty reduction a top priority in Canada.
How much of it is realization and really giving people an understanding that they have permission to step out and do the least that they need to do to get the job done?
Well, I'm very hopeful that people who have listened to this will see it as a gift in many ways to the listening public, to Canada. Here's what Daily Bread has said. There's a ton of different policies out there. There's a ton of different solutions that have been brought forward. And throughout this podcast, and my hope is that they take that and run with it, and in exchange for that gift, I'm hopeful that they will phone their elected official and say, we too share that view that everybody has a right to food, and that we do need to implement the everything possible to be able to realize that goal for 2030. Right now, Talia's pregnant, and my,
you can't tell by the podcast
no.
pictures that we're showing.
But my hope is that child grows up in a Canada where nobody's right to food is unrealized. that they look back and say, Mom, the work that you did, well, let's call it 20 years ago, because they'll have to go through their teenage years first. So 20 years from now, that child looks back at this podcast and said, you moved the needle. There's fewer people on the waiting list for social housing. There's fewer people in line at the at Daily Bread. You moved the needle, and I'm proud of you. And that ultimately is the kind of country that I think everybody wants to live in.
Well, I should say that, once we do our roundtables and then we have a fairly unvarnished, and I try not to edit the conversation. And there's some editing and processing and production that does go into it, just to make sure that we have the best sound quality possible. There will be less of that here, and I do that on purpose because I want you to hear what it sounds like in the background and the work that's going on and the volunteers that come here and do this on a daily basis. And the Daily Bread Food Bank, of course, is not the only one committed to reducing poverty in this country, certainly by the year 2030. But to Neil's point, to Talia's point, it's not about necessarily the organizations, it's about the people who are behind us, the people like you who can have that kind of an effect. Maybe it's having the conversation with your kids around the dinner table when it comes to those values that Neil talked about, and being able to say the reason that we're able to have this is because we have this level of privilege. We have this opportunity to help others who we may not otherwise know, but hide in plain view. So I thought it was important to be here to do this. And as noisy as it might sound, my apologies to the audience, but I thought we needed to put you there.
No, let's not apologize for because it's an army of the caring. It's people who are fundamentally caring, as you said, Dave. These volunteers are here because they believe in that fundamental mission, that right to food, and there are so many. There are thousands all across the country, and they vote. And so let's make sure that they're voting for the right policies that will result in change.
Neil, Talia, it's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for listening to the 2030 Project. We would encourage you to subscribe to the show. We're on Apple and Spotify, Google, Audible, pretty much anywhere you get your podcasts. We'd also be grateful if you'd offer a rating on the show. We'd love your thoughts, your feedback, even your criticism. The 2030 Project podcast series is sponsored by Daily Bread Food Bank, a Toronto-based charity whose mission is to collaborate with all to eliminate food insecurity and advocate for solutions to end poverty. I'm Dave Trafford, and the 2030 Project is an Eye Contact production.